Saigon, South Vietnam, October 15, 1969. On the Caravelle Hotel rooftop, a man under diplomatic cover lifts a champagne flute while the city hums like a live wire below. He thinks he's untouchable, protected by papers and protocol. But the CIA's singer has already started a timer he cannot see. The vial is labeled TTX, a toxin that doesn't need a gunshot to win. She laughs at his jokes, leans in close for what he believes is a confidential interview, and makes one quiet move that can't be unsaid. 12 hours later, his body will collapse while she's already gone. This is Operation Saigon Siren. In the CIA's Saigon station lore, Linda Morrison wasn't recruited because she could fight. She was recruited because she could perform. Born in Montreal in the late 1930s, she grew up bilingual in a household where English and French weren't just languages, but currencies of access. Her formative lesson came early. A wartime family scandal taught her that truth is rarely persuasive, but tone always is. When her uncle was accused of black market dealings in 1944, young Linda watched him talk his way clear, not by denying the facts, but by controlling how people felt about them. The lesson hardened into skill. By her mid-20s, Morrison had refined what intelligence officers would later call a natural legend, the ability to build trust on command and live inside a fabricated identity without flinching. Her recruitment into CIA's Special Operations Group came through a talent spotter in 1963 who watched her defuse a tense situation at a diplomatic reception in Paris. A minor attaché had made an ethnic slur. Morrison, posing as a freelance photographer, turned the moment into a joke that made the offender laugh at himself while the room stayed calm. The spotter noted her file. Exceptional situational awareness, zero visible calculation, fluent performance under social pressure. Those traits made her valuable. By 1969, Morrison had run access operations in 3 countries, building covers that ranged from art dealer to relief worker. Her defining operational talent in one sentence: she could weaponize intimacy without leaving emotional fingerprints. Saigon in 1969 was a city where allegiance was currency and everyone suspected everyone. The war had fractured trust into 1,000 pieces. South Vietnamese security watched Americans. Americans watched each other. The Viet Cong maintained networks that could disappear into crowds or emerge as government officials. In this environment, the Caravelle Hotel became operationally significant, not despite its visibility, but because of it. The rooftop bar sat 10 stories above the streets, offering a view over the city and its violence. Foreign correspondents filed stories from its tables. Diplomats negotiated over drinks. Intelligence officers from multiple services circled each other with professional courtesy that barely masked surveillance. The hotel was a crossroads, and crossroads are where intelligence work happens. The strategy behind Operation Saigon Siren fit the era's grim doctrine. By 1969, American intelligence had shifted focus from conventional military targets to what analysts called political infrastructure. The logic was straightforward. Kill a Viet Cong fighter and another takes his place within days. But remove a senior commander and you disrupt coordination networks for weeks or months. This philosophy had been formalized in programs like I-6, later renamed Phoenix, which framed neutralization as capture, defection, or killing. Rand Corporation analysts had documented the approach in classified assessments. The target list expanded to include not just military leaders, but political officers, supply coordinators, and anyone who held the insurgency's administrative networks together. Traditional options failed on paper before they reached operational planning. A raid on a diplomatic gathering risked a firefight that would embarrass the South Vietnamese government and trigger international condemnation. Surveillance could track the target, but couldn't confirm identity fast enough in a city where faces changed and cover stories multiplied. Bribery invited double crosses in an environment thick with competing intelligence services. Assassination by sniper or bomb would be attributed immediately to American or South Vietnamese action, making the target a martyr and triggering retaliation. The station's conclusion was ruthless, but operationally sound. If the target is hiding in plain sight behind diplomatic immunity, you don't storm the building. You change the room. The obstacles defined the operational approach. First, the commander's diplomatic shield. He traveled on papers that granted immunity from arrest and search. South Vietnamese security couldn't touch him without creating an international incident. Second, constant counter-surveillance. The Caravelle was full of watchers watching watchers. Any American approaching the target would be noted, tracked, and reported. Third, the death had to read as natural. A body with gunshot wounds or poison symptoms would trigger investigations that could expose methods and compromise future operations. The requirement wasn't just success, but invisibility. The trigger came when a source inside the hotel staff reported a pattern. The commander visited the Caravelle rooftop bar twice weekly, always on Tuesday and Friday evenings. He preferred conversations in quieter corners, away from the main crowd. Twice in the past month, he had moved discussions from the public bar to a hotel suite for what he called confidential meetings. The pattern suggested vulnerability. If privacy was what he sought, privacy could become the kill room. The planning authorization came through Saigon Station in late August 1969. Morrison received the operational brief on September 2nd. The execution window was 6 weeks. During the planning phase, Morrison experienced what CIA psychologists called legend integration stress. For 43 days, she would live as Michelle Laurent, a French-Canadian freelance journalist working for Paris Match. The cover wasn't just documents. It was rhythm, habit, and accumulated detail. She studied Laurent's supposed background until she could reference childhood streets in Montreal without hesitation. She memorized Laurent's professional history, 3 years covering European politics before transferring to Southeast Asia in 1968. She practiced Laurent's mannerisms, a slight tilt of the head when listening, a habit of touching her camera strap when thinking. In post-operation psychological assessments, Morrison would describe the process as controlled dissociation. You don't pretend to be someone else. You become them enough that the lies feel true. The target represented what analysts called a Category 2 priority. Intelligence indicated he was a senior political officer in the Viet Cong's Urban Coordination Network, responsible for managing safe houses and courier routes in Saigon's diplomatic quarter. Intercepted communications from July 1969 captured him discussing family visits with his sister in Hanoi. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant in the exchange. He had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. He worried about their school performance. He sent money when he could. When the operation succeeded, those daughters would receive news that their father had died of sudden cardiac failure in a foreign city. The calculation was made at levels above Morrison's clearance. Disrupting the courier network could save American and South Vietnamese lives. One man's death weighed against dozens, maybe hundreds. The math was cold but consistent with doctrine. By October 1st, 1969, the operation entered its execution phase. A source confirmed the target would attend a diplomatic reception at the Caravelle on October 10th. Morrison had 6 days to establish Michelle Laurent as a credible, recurring presence. The window was narrow but sufficient. The infrastructure was already in place. Morrison built the legend package for Michel Laurent with operational precision. The cover required 3 layers: documentation, performance, and social verification. Documentation came first. A forged assignment letter from Paris Match, backdated to August 1969, authorized Laurent to cover political developments in South Vietnam. The letter referenced a legitimate editor whose name appeared on Paris Match mastheads, but whose actual role was coordinating with French intelligence, creating a callback chain that would confirm Laurent's credentials if anyone checked. The phone number routed through a cutout in Bangkok, who had been briefed on Laurent's supposed assignment history. The forged press credentials used paper stock and seal patterns identical to legitimate French government issues. Produced by CIA's Technical Services Division, the performance layer required visibility without attention. For 6 weeks beginning in late August, Morrison appeared at the Caravelle 3 nights per week. She sang jazz standards at the rooftop bar during the hotel's informal evening entertainment. A rotation of local and expatriate performers. Her repertoire included Autumn Leaves and La Vie en Rose, songs that positioned her as culturally French without being politically provocative. On 2 other nights each week, she worked the hotel lobby and restaurant with a Leica M3 camera, taking photographs of guests and street scenes, filing them with a legitimate wire service that had agreed to accept occasional freelance submissions. One afternoon, she allowed a minor Associated Press journalist to quote her in a sidebar piece about foreign correspondence in Saigon, creating a paper trail that seeded credibility into the city's information network. The social verification came from accumulated detail. She established a rhythm. She arrived at the bar between 1900 hours and 2000 hours, never precisely the same time. She drank wine, usually white, never more than 2 glasses over an evening. She spoke with other correspondents about safe topics: hotel conditions, visa difficulties, the quality of film development services in Saigon. She complained about the war in vague, fashionably cynical terms that mirrored the target's propaganda just enough to sound like European skepticism without triggering suspicion. Associates would later describe her as present but not intrusive, friendly but professionally distant. Exactly the profile of a working journalist, more interested in stories than in people. The infrastructure supporting Morrison was lean by design. A safe flat 3 blocks from the Caravelle served as her operational base, rented under Laurent's cover identity with 6 months paid in advance. Communication with her handling case officer followed a one-time pad message format for short updates. Dead drops at 2 locations in the city's commercial district, and a single emergency signal protocol involving a chalk mark on a specific telephone pole. The team structure maintained compartmentalization. Morrison functioned as the access agent, the only operative with direct target contact. Her handling case officer, based at the Saigon station, managed logistics and maintained oversight, but never appeared near the operation. A medical advisor had briefed her on the toxin's effects and delivery method during a 2-hour session in early September, but had no further operational role. Enough expertise to execute, not enough connections to create investigative fingerprints. The toxin itself was tetrodotoxin, commonly abbreviated TTX, a neurotoxin found naturally in certain species of pufferfish. TTX blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, causing paralysis that progresses from extremities to respiratory muscles. At sufficient doses, it produces death by asphyxiation as the diaphragm fails. The appeal for covert operations was its delayed onset and symptom profile. Depending on dose and delivery method, effects could manifest anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours after exposure. Initial symptoms resembled food poisoning or cardiac distress. Numbness, dizziness, nausea, difficulty breathing. Medical examiners without specific knowledge of TTX poisoning would likely attribute death to natural causes, particularly cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. CIA's Technical Services Division had studied TTX as part of a broader interest in untraceable methods, research that would later surface in congressional oversight hearings about assassination programs. First contact was engineered on October 7, 1969. Morrison had tracked the target's pattern for 3 weeks. He arrived at the Caravelle rooftop bar on Tuesday evenings around 2000 hours, usually alone, occasionally with a male companion identified as a junior aide. He preferred a corner table near the western railing where conversations stayed private. Morrison positioned herself near the bar's entrance at 1945 hours, time to intercept his approach. The staged collision was simple. A dropped lighter, an apology in French, a shared complaint about the evening heat. She mentioned covering the Paris protests of 1968, a detail designed to signal sympathy with anti-establishment movements. The target responded with polite interest, but no commitment. The encounter lasted 90 seconds. She withdrew to the bar, sang 2 songs, and left by 2200 hours. Contact established, no pressure applied. 2 complications emerged during the approach phase that nearly derailed the operation. First, a rival watcher began mirroring Morrison's movements during the 3rd week of September. The watcher was male, mid-30s, appearing at the Caravelle on the same nights Morrison performed, always positioned with sightlines to her location. South Vietnamese security or another intelligence service, the identification remained unclear. Morrison's handling case officer assessed the watcher as passive surveillance, cataloging rather than interdicting, but the presence forced tactical adjustments. Morrison varied her arrival times and occasionally skipped scheduled nights to disrupt pattern recognition. The watcher's presence complicated but didn't terminate the operation. Second, on October 10th, the target arrived at the bar with his diplomatic aide, a man who asked questions that felt wrong. The aide focused less on Morrison's journalism and more on her contacts in Saigon. Who else did she interview? Which officials had she spoken with? Which hotels did foreign correspondents prefer for discreet meetings? The questions probed for connections, testing whether Morrison was more than she appeared. She deflected with professional complaints about source access, pivoted to questions about the aide's own background, and ended the conversation when she claimed another appointment. The encounter increased operational risk. If the aide suspected Morrison's cover, the entire approach would collapse. But the target himself seemed untroubled. Even intrigued by her combination of skepticism toward American policy and apparent access to Western media platforms. The execution window opened on October 14th when the target proposed the critical upgrade. He approached Morrison at the bar and suggested a confidential interview, not in the public space, but in a hotel suite where they could speak without interruption. He framed it as an opportunity for her to hear perspectives the Western media typically ignored. She accepted with calculated hesitance, asking about timing and format, establishing herself as professionally cautious rather than eager. They agreed on October 15th, 2000 hours, Suite 412. The target would arrange for champagne and privacy. Morrison would bring her camera and notebook, maintaining the journalist cover until the final moment. October 15th, 1969. At 1800 hours, Morrison conducted final preparation at the safe flat. She reviewed the delivery method one last time, a technique that relied on misdirection rather than force. The TTX had been prepared in liquid form, measured to a dose that would cause symptoms within 6 to 8 hours and death within 12. The container was a modified cosmetic vial, small enough to conceal in a camera bag, designed to leave no residue that would survive casual inspection. The critical technical requirement was contact or ingestion. TTX does not absorb effectively through intact skin, but is lethal if introduced to mucous membranes or the digestive system. The delivery method exploited a moment of vulnerability. A laugh timed to the target's distraction, a single tradecraft move designed to complete before awareness could form. At 19:30 hours, Morrison entered the Caravelle through the main entrance, visible to hotel security and any watchers. She wore professional clothing, dark slacks and a light jacket, carrying a camera bag and a small leather portfolio. She nodded to the desk clerk, a gesture of familiarity that reinforced her cover as a regular presence. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. At 19:48 hours, she knocked on suite 412. The target opened the door himself. No aide present. The suite was modest by Western standards, but private. A sitting area with 2 chairs and a small table. A bedroom visible through a half-open door. Curtains drawn against the evening. A champagne bottle sat in an ice bucket. 2 glasses waited on the table. The first 18 minutes followed a script both participants understood. Morrison set up her camera on the table, creating the visual grammar of an interview. She asked about his background, his political views, his assessment of American strategy. The target spoke with confidence, framing the war as inevitable liberation delayed by foreign interference. Morrison guided the conversation toward ideology, then toward ego, asking how he maintained conviction in the face of overwhelming American firepower. The target's response revealed the vulnerability Morrison had been mapping. Certainty. He believed the room was his, the conversation under his control, the journalist a useful tool for spreading his message. At 20:06 hours, the champagne arrived via room service. The target poured 2 glasses himself, a gesture of hospitality that doubled as control. He handed 1 glass to Morrison. She accepted, raised it in a neutral toast, and took a small sip. The target drank more substantially. The conversation continued. Morrison steered toward questions about coordination networks, testing how much he would reveal, building a rhythm of question and answer that normalized trust. At 20:17 hours, the critical moment arrived. Morrison asked a question about his family, a detail she knew from intercepted communications. The target glanced away briefly, momentary confusion about how she knew. In that instant of divided attention, Morrison executed the delivery. The tradecraft specifics remain operationally sensitive, but the principle was vulnerability mapping. The target's focus on maintaining conversational control created a blind spot. His belief that Morrison was engaged in the interview, not the interruption, narrowed his awareness. The method required neither force nor obvious action, just a move that completed in the space between one sentence and the next. The target returned his attention to the conversation, unaware that exposure had occurred. By 21:03 hours, Morrison had concluded the interview. She packed her camera, thanked the target for his time, and expressed interest in a follow-up conversation. The target walked her to the door, still confident, already planning how to use the interview for propaganda advantage. Morrison exited the suite, took the elevator to the lobby, and left the Caravelle through the main entrance. She walked 2 blocks to a pre-arranged taxi, which drove her to a safe house in Cholon. By 22:30 hours, she was on the exfiltration chain toward Bangkok, traveling under different documents, the Michel Laurent identity already being dismantled. The delayed onset of TTX was the operation's final protection. By the time symptoms manifested, Morrison would be beyond reach. The toxin's progression followed the predicted timeline. Tetrodotoxin blocks voltage-gated sodium channels, preventing nerve cells from generating action potentials. Initial symptoms typically begin with perioral numbness and tingling in the extremities, progressing to generalized weakness. As the toxin concentration increases, respiratory muscle paralysis develops, leading to hypoventilation and eventual respiratory arrest. Cardiovascular collapse follows as oxygenation fails. At 0430 hours on October 16th, approximately 8.5 hours after exposure, the target collapsed in his hotel room. Hotel staff discovered him at 0600 hours when he failed to respond to a scheduled wake-up call. A South Vietnamese doctor pronounced him dead at 0642 hours. The preliminary assessment recorded sudden cardiac failure, a diagnosis that raised no immediate suspicion given the target's age and the stressful environment. By 0800 hours on October 16th, South Vietnamese security had sealed Suite 412 and begun preliminary investigation. The inquiry followed standard protocol for the death of a foreign national on diplomatic business. Investigators cataloged the room's contents: champagne bottle and glasses, camera equipment absent, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Hotel staff reported the target had entertained a female visitor the previous evening, a journalist conducting an interview. The visitor had left before 2200 hours. The target had been alive when she departed. Staff provided a description: Western woman, mid-30s, dark hair, professional demeanor, carried camera equipment. The description matched dozens of foreign correspondents working in Saigon. The investigation produced leads that ended in carefully constructed dead ends. South Vietnamese intelligence contacted Paris Match through diplomatic channels, inquiring about Michel Laurent. The callback chain functioned as designed. A voice in Bangkok confirmed that Laurent was on assignment in Southeast Asia and had filed several photo submissions in recent weeks. The voice provided a Paris telephone number that connected to an office where a secretary acknowledged Laurent as a freelance contributor. The paper trail was thin, but sufficient. Nothing conclusively proved Laurent existed as claimed, but nothing definitively proved she didn't. In an environment where cover stories layered over cover stories, the ambiguity was expected. The investigation noted Laurent's presence and moved to other angles. Forensic examination of the target's body revealed no immediate evidence of foul play. The South Vietnamese medical examiner, working without sophisticated toxicology equipment, observed symptoms consistent with cardiac arrest: cyanosis, pulmonary edema, no external trauma. Blood samples were taken, but the laboratory lacked capacity to test for exotic toxins like TTX. The samples would have required specialized analysis in facilities not available in Saigon. The official conclusion recorded sudden cardiac failure, possibly stress-induced, a determination that satisfied administrative requirements without triggering deeper investigation. Every lead ended in ambiguity, suggesting sophistication but providing no actionable evidence. Official reactions diverged sharply from private assessments. Publicly, South Vietnamese authorities issued a brief statement acknowledging the death of a foreign diplomat from natural causes. No foul play suspected. Investigation closed pending routine autopsy results. The Viet Cong maintained silence for 3 days, then released a statement claiming one of their political officers had been murdered by American intelligence while conducting diplomatic outreach. The accusation was ignored by Western media as propaganda. No evidence supported the claim. The denials were transparent to intelligence professionals on all sides, but transparency wasn't the point. The CIA could maintain plausible deniability. The Viet Cong could claim martyrdom for recruitment purposes. South Vietnamese security could tighten protocols without admitting failure. Everyone understood what happened. No one could prove it. Inside the intelligence community, Operation Saigon Siren updated operational playbooks across multiple services. The Caravelle remained a hub for diplomatic and journalistic activity, but trust thinned perceptibly. Western intelligence officers noted increased counter-surveillance around foreign correspondents. South Vietnamese security began requiring additional documentation for hotel suite reservations involving foreign nationals. The Viet Cong adjusted protocols for public meetings, adding security sweeps and witness verification. The operation's success lay not in remaining invisible, but in remaining unprovable. The method could be suspected, even assumed, but could not be definitively established. The strategic assessment split along predictable lines. Tactically, the operation achieved its immediate objective. The target's death disrupted coordination networks in Saigon's diplomatic quarter. Courier routes required rerouting. Safe house locations needed verification with a new authority. Meetings were canceled or postponed while the network reorganized. Intelligence intercepts in the weeks following the operation captured confusion and paranoia among Viet Cong operatives. Trust became a liability. Anyone could be compromised. The psychological impact multiplied the tactical gain. If the target truly held senior coordination responsibilities, the short-term disruption was operationally valuable. The cost calculation was more complex. Diplomatically, the operation increased tension without triggering crisis. South Vietnamese officials privately expressed frustration at American methods, but the relationship survived. The Viet Cong's propaganda claim generated brief news coverage, but faded quickly without evidence. Operationally, the method revealed tradecraft capabilities that forced adaptations. Future targets would be more cautious about private meetings with foreign journalists. The psychological cost was harder to measure. Morrison's post-operation debrief, conducted in Bangkok 3 weeks later, noted successful compartmentalization of identity. Michel Laurent had been a performance, discarded after use. But the act of weaponizing trust and intimacy, building rapport designed to enable killing, left markers in psychological assessments that would follow Morrison through subsequent assignments. The human cost was unambiguous. The target left 2 daughters and a sister in Hanoi. His death was reported as cardiac failure during diplomatic work, a story that satisfied official requirements but left questions families ask. His network of colleagues faced suspicion and reorganization. The hotel staff who unknowingly facilitated the operation carried no legal responsibility, but lived with proximity to an event whose true nature they could suspect but never confirm. Morrison herself carried operational success at the cost of what CIA psychologists called moral injury. The psychological damage from actions that conflict with personal values, even when justified by strategic necessity. The calculation was made at levels above field operatives. One man's death weighed against potential lives saved. The math was consistent with doctrine. Whether the math was correct remained debatable. Operation Saigon Siren's legacy extended beyond its immediate tactical success. The operation became part of classified instruction on access operations and plausible deniability. The method, using cover identities and delayed action toxins to create deaths that appeared natural, fit into a broader Cold War obsession with clean killings. Congressional oversight hearings in the mid-1970s revealed CIA research into untraceable assassination methods, including a device popularly called the heart attack gun, a weapon that could deliver toxin via dart, leaving a mark so small it could be mistaken for an insect bite. The hearings documented institutional interest in methods that achieved results without evidence. Operation Saigon Siren exemplified that philosophy. Operational success measured by the absence of proof. The moral question embedded in Operation Saigon Siren refuses simple resolution. From one perspective, this was wartime triage executed with surgical precision. The target was a combatant in an active conflict, responsible for coordinating networks that facilitated attacks on American and South Vietnamese forces. Traditional military action could have killed him alongside bodyguards, bystanders, or hotel staff. The operation minimized collateral damage to a single death, arguably saving lives that would be lost in a raid or bombing. The deception was a tool, not the crime. The method was efficient, the result was strategic, and the context was war. From the opposing perspective, the operation represents assassination by intimate betrayal. The method wasn't combat, but seduction, using fabricated identity and staged attraction to gain access a soldier never would. The target died not on a battlefield, but in a private room where he believed himself safe, killed by someone he thought was listening to his ideas. The delayed toxin meant he spent his final hours unaware death was approaching, robbed of the chance to prepare or resist. The clinical efficiency doesn't erase the fundamental deception. Trust exploited, intimacy weaponized, a person reduced to a target through performance art. The operation succeeded precisely because it violated the social contract that separates warfare from murder. The calculation forces a harder question than simple right or wrong. If you can eliminate a coordinator of lethal operations without risking your own forces, but only by lying your way into their confidence and using their trust as the delivery mechanism, does that make the operation strategically sound or morally corrosive? Does the answer change if the target's death prevents future attacks? Does it change if the operative who performed the deception carries psychological damage afterward? The operation worked because deception was the weapon. Who pays the bill for that success? What's your take? If removing one person from a war's coordination network could save dozens of lives, but the method requires building false intimacy and betraying manufactured trust, is that strategic necessity or a corruption of warfare itself? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider where the line between intelligence work and assassination actually falls, hit that like button and share. The operations that history never proves are the ones that reveal what we're willing to accept when victory requires methods we'd rather not examine too closely.